We're going to start tonight's class with a brief discussion on sampling. Although sampling is often thought of as a design issue, it also has unique issues that are connected to the quality of a qualitative study. As I've mentioned before, sampling is one of the distinguishing factors between qualitative and quantitative methodology. Quantitative methodology uses probability sampling, which allows us to generalize to a given population. Qualitative methodology is not designed to generalize. Instead, it uses a purposeful sampling strategy, where a sample is selected based on its ability to support and provide an understanding for the purpose of the study. Although the aims of sampling are very different across the two methodologies, the question of how large should my sample be is still relevant for a qualitative study. There is the important logistical need to know how much data is enough, so that you know how to design the study, and so you know when to stop collecting data. How much data is enough also becomes an important question for assessing the quality of a qualitative study. Did the researcher collect enough data to answer the question robustly? Or is the data so thin that the researcher needs to cherry pick quotes or examples in an attempt to describe a phenomenon or build an argument? Another problem with not enough data is ending up with a study that cannot add anything substantial to the field. So, as Tracy says in her article, how much data is enough is a question a researcher has to ask and answer in every single study. The question is often asked at the beginning, the middle, and the end of the study. However, this is not the same as calculating a sufficient end to determine if you have the power to answer your research question. Likewise, since a qualitative study is not meant to generalize, discussion sections that identify having a small sample as a limitation because it makes generalizations impossible are highly problematic. Either you're saying your sample is too small to provide robust findings, or you're saying that you don't understand the purpose of your study. Neither is good. Although qualitative studies use purposeful samples, reviewers often treat the number of participants as an important criteria for the quality of the study. This may be the primary reason why researchers want to discuss it as a limitation, in an attempt to foreshadow reviewers' comments. Unfortunately, this is not a helpful technique. Instead, it is important to describe and to plan for the robustness of your sample. Keep in mind that the size of your sample might not be just the number of people who participated in your study. If you've included observational data, it may also be the number of observations you conducted, or the number of episodes or settings you observed. It may contain the breadth in the form of different types of data, or the depth in the form of multiple and/or lengthy interviews with each participant of your study. In describing the robustness of your sample, you may want to discuss the quality of the data, or the length of the interviews, or the number of transcribed pages. All of these may give the reader a better sense of the amount of data that constitutes your study. There are also rules of thumbs you can find in different reference books and articles about sample size for different qualitative approaches. For example, one rule of thumb is approximately 10 interviews for a phenomenology. However, for every rule of thumb you find, you can generally find a conflicting one. Citing rules of thumb as a justification for a sample size is not particularly convincing. Instead, you need to think about the elements of your study and develop a defensible estimate for it. You then need to revisit this estimate as you conduct your study and you analyze your data. Janice Morse is the editor of the journal Qualitative Health, arguably the premier journal for qualitative researches in health fields. She has written extensively on issues of sample size and saturation. The elements she has identified as important to consider are the scope of the study. How broad or narrow is your study? The broader it is, the more data you will need to fully answer your questions. Also, what is the nature of the topic? Is it an obvious and straightforward topic? A topic participants will be able to speak about directly? Or is it a more ambiguous and subtle topic that will require a more nuanced approach and probably more data to address? What is the quality of your data? Some participants or observations provide rich data without much prompting, while others are difficult to engage with. How are your skills at interviewing and observing? The quality of your data has a lot to do with its richness. What about the design of your study? For example, a longitudinal study may require a smaller number of participants, but more interviews will be conducted with each one. Morse also gives us the concept of shadowed data. These are examples expressed by your participants or other people's experiences. Often, when telling stories of their own experiences, people will describe other people's. They will talk about the person they know who had a similar or different experience. These stories within your participant's story, Morse calls shadow data. A study with a lot of shadow data may not need as many participants as other studies. Saturation is the concept we use to say that we have finished collecting our data. It is the concept that any new data you collect will not add conceptually to the study, that no new information will be generated by new data. Many people say their data was saturated, but few actually show how they determine that. Without collecting new data, it's difficult to know when saturation has actually happened. Morse tells us that there is no way to saturate on particular details of events or incidents. Everyone will have unique aspects of their story. However, there is a way to saturate the categories that emerge from our data. The first key is to look at the scope of your data relative to the scope of your topic or study. Does the data you have cover all the issues and nuances of your phenomenon? Does it have breadth across the issues and enough depth within the issues to make meaningful statements? Do the data from several sources have essential characteristics in common? Are you seeing replication of the components of your categories or themes, even if the details are different? When the researcher can confidently and competently discuss their data, and these discussions are rich in description and interpretation, it is likely they have reached saturation. As I mentioned, most studies will not show how saturation was determined. However, one of my doctoral students took this task to heart and included a description of how she determined saturation in a paper that we wrote. Here is the written description from that paper, which was a phenomenological study of homeless women's encounters with service providers. Since she was analyzing the data as she was collecting it, she was able to keep a running chart of the themes that were emerging to describe her phenomenology. Although she interviewed 15 participants, she was able to show that no new themes emerged after the 11th one. Here's the table she provided as visual proof of theoretical saturation. As you can see, the final theme of minimized shows up for the first time in the 11th interview, and then does not show up again until the 15th. It is likely we would have seen it again if she had continued to interview, but less likely that we would have seen a completely new theme arise. Sometimes having rich and saturated data is not enough. You also have to satisfy reviewers that either you can or you have gathered enough data to answer your research questions. In the early stages, when you're writing your proposal, you need to specify the minimum sample you will collect based on an expected reasonable coverage of your phenomenon, given its purpose and scope, as well as the stakeholders' interest, or what they see as reasonable outcomes of the study in terms of it being broad or narrow. Once you have that minimum, you need to build a rationale or argument for it. You also need to provide the criteria for when you'll know you've reached it. In other words, your design has to include a way of continuously assessing the data you have collected in terms of what, if any, additional data you will need. For reviewers of manuscripts, you need a slightly different approach. Here, you can't make promises of what you will do to make sure you get the data you need. You have to justify the data you have. You need to include a broader picture of your sample than just stating the number of participants, and you need to provide the rationale justification for why that is enough data to answer your question. It also helps to find a way to verify the richness of your data, which could include having outsiders review your early findings before you've actually left the field.